In August 1977, a desperate call to the British police would forever change the history of the paranormal. A single mother, Peggy Hodgson, couldn't explain what was happening in her modest house at 284 Green Street in Enfield, London. Her children screamed in terror as furniture moved by itself. Mysterious knocks echoed through the walls, and objects flew across rooms without any explanation. What began as an ordinary night became one of the most documented and controversial paranormal cases in modern history. But here's the truth they've never told you completely. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to unravel the darkest secrets of the Enfield Poltergeist, those details that investigators preferred to keep silent, the contradictions they never wanted to admit, and the confessions that completely change our perception of what really happened in that cursed house. Was it all real, or the most elaborate lie ever created? Why were the famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren barely involved in the case, despite what Hollywood made us believe? And what about that confession from Janet Hodgson that the media hid for decades? Get ready, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about one of the world's most famous paranormal cases. And I'll tell you something in advance. The most respected investigators had very specific reasons for silencing certain details that today will finally come to light. It all began on the night of August 30th, 1977. Peggy Hodgson, who lived there, with her 4 children, Margaret, 12, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7, claimed she first knew something was wrong after there was a crash upstairs. But what the family didn't expect was that this first incident would be just the beginning of a nightmare that would extend for more than 2 years. In August 1977, Peggy called the police after her children claimed that furniture was moving by itself, and there were knocking sounds coming from the walls. The officers who responded to the call witnessed something that would change their lives forever. One of the officers witnessed a chair sliding across the floor without anyone touching it, an event that was documented in official police records. The most disturbing thing about these first days wasn't just the objects that moved, but the way. The activity seemed to focus specifically on the 2 eldest daughters of the family. The alleged poltergeist activity centered on sisters Janet, 11, and Margaret Hodgson, 13. But why them? What did these girls have that made them the epicenter of such a destructive force? The Hodgson family would be affected by beds that lifted, furniture that moved, and chairs that overturned. The knocks ran up and down the hallways or faded so much that soon no one felt comfortable sleeping without the lights on. Objects were often thrown across the room by themselves. During these first weeks, something more sinister began to manifest. The knocks weren't random. They responded to questions. If someone asked, "Is anyone there?" 2 clear knocks were heard. If they asked the age of the entity, the knocks corresponded to specific numbers. It was as if something intelligent, something conscious, was trying to communicate from the other side. When the events became impossible to ignore, the family sought professional help. It was then that Maurice Grosse, an investigator from the prestigious Society for Psychical Research in London, arrived at Green Street. Grosse wasn't a Hollywood ghost hunter. He was a man of science, an engineer with decades of experience investigating paranormal phenomena with rigorous methodology. What Grosse documented during his first visits challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. Audio recordings captured voices that didn't belong to any family member. Photographs showed objects suspended in air without any possible physical explanation, and independent witnesses confirmed events that science couldn't explain. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Grosse didn't work alone. Guy Lyon Playfair, another respected investigator, joined the case, and together they documented more than 1,500 paranormal incidents during the 18 months the investigation lasted. However, both investigators kept certain findings secret that they considered too disturbing for the general public. One of the things that most disturbed them was the intelligence behind the phenomena. These weren't random events. There was a calculating mind orchestrating each movement, each manifestation. Objects didn't just move, they moved with purpose, with malice. The voices didn't just speak, they answered specific questions with knowledge that no 11-year-old child could possess. During a particularly intense recording session, the investigators captured something that chilled their blood. A voice, clearly, different from Janet's, whispered specific threats against the investigators, mentioning details of their personal lives that no one in the house could have known. These recordings were classified as confidential and were never made public for reasons you'll soon understand. What did Grosse and Playfair really find in that house? Why do certain aspects of their investigation remain hidden to this day? And, more importantly, what made them decide that some truths were too dangerous to be revealed? The case took a truly terrifying turn when Janet Hodgson began showing signs of what investigators classified as partial possession. Janet often entered a trance-like state where she spoke with a deep, harsh voice, claiming to be the ghost of a man named Bill Wilkins, who had died in the house years before. What makes this absolutely chilling is that the investigators verified the existence of Bill Wilkins. It was later confirmed that a man with that name was once a resident of the house and died of a hemorrhage while sitting in the living room. An 11-year-old girl couldn't have had access to these historical records, especially considering we're talking about 1977, decades before the Internet. During these communication sessions, the voice that emerged from Janet provided specific details about Wilkins' life, his family, his habits, and even the exact location where he died in the house. He spoke with a pronounced Cockney accent, completely different from Janet's natural accent, and used expressions and vocabulary from an earlier generation. Janet claimed that the ghost would speak through her for hours at a time. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the duration of these episodes, but the content of the conversations. Wilkins, speaking through Janet, expressed deep anger at the family's presence in his house. He described how he had observed the family for months before deciding to manifest, studying their routines, their fears, their weaknesses. The investigators were completely baffled when Wilkins began revealing information about other deceased residents of the house, people whose existence had never been officially documented. He mentioned names, dates, specific events that were later verified through extensive research in local archives and testimonies from elderly neighbors. But there was something more sinister in these communications. Wilkins wasn't the only entity present. Through Janet, other voices began to manifest, each with its own personality, its own story, its own agenda. It was as if the house were a portal for multiple trapped spirits, and Janet had become their means of communication with the world of the living. This is where the popular narrative deviates dramatically from reality. The movie, The Conjuring 2, presents Ed and Lorraine Warren as the principal investigators of the Enfield case, but the truth is completely different and much more disturbing. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren briefly investigated the Enfield Poltergeist in the summer of 1978 and were just two of many investigators who visited the Hodgson house on Green Street, North London. The key word here is briefly. The Warrens weren't the heroes Hollywood wanted us to believe. In fact, the truth about the Warrens' involvement is much more controversial. Ed and Lorraine Warren were never part of the Enfield Poltergeist investigation. They simply showed up at the door to propose a scam to make money and were rejected by the family and the investigators, Guy Playfair and the head of the British Psychical Research Team. This revelation completely changes our understanding of the case. The Warrens, who had established themselves as the principal authorities on paranormal cases in the United States, saw in Enfield an opportunity to expand their influence internationally. But when they arrived in London with commercial proposals, they were rejected by the serious investigators who were already working on the case. Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated the Enfield Poltergeist, though to a much lesser extent than was represented in The Conjuring 2. Ed and Lorraine were just two of many paranormal experts who visited the residence to investigate the claims. Why were the Warrens marginalized in the real case? The British. Investigators had serious concerns about the Warrens' methods and their commercial motivations. Maurice Grosse and Lyon Playfair were committed to rigorous scientific investigation, while the Warrens seemed more interested in publicity and economic profit. This tension between investigators reveals something deeper about the Enfield case. Not everyone who claimed to be experts had the same intentions, and the Hodgson family found themselves at the center of a battle between different approaches to understanding the paranormal. Not everyone was convinced of the authenticity of the events in Enfield. Some of the most prominent skeptics of the time visited the house and left with conclusions that completely challenged the paranormal narrative. Anita Gregory, an experimental psychologist from the University of London, spent time observing the phenomena and concluded that there was significant evidence of deliberate deception. Gregory documented several cases where Janet was caught manipulating objects when she thought she wasn't being observed. Milburn Christopher, a professional magician and investigator of fraudulent paranormal phenomena, also visited the house. His experience in illusionism allowed him to identify specific techniques that could explain many of the reported events. Christopher demonstrated how some of the most spectacular phenomena could be replicated using completely natural methods. But here's where the situation becomes truly complex. Even the hardest skeptics admitted they couldn't explain all the events. There were phenomena that occurred under controlled conditions, with multiple independent witnesses, that defied conventional explanations. Physicist Dr. David Fontana, initially skeptical, spent months investigating the case and eventually became one of its most vocal defenders. Fontana documented events that occurred even when all family members were under direct observation, making any form of conscious deception impossible. This division between believers and skeptics wasn't just academic. It had real implications for the Hodgson family, who found themselves being judged not only for the phenomena they experienced, but also for their credibility as witnesses. The debates became so intense that some investigation sessions turned into open confrontations between investigators with different perspectives. It was as if the same phenomenon affecting the family was dividing the scientific community. Here we come to the heart of the controversy that has haunted the Enfield case for decades. In 1982, 5 years after the events began, Janet Hodgson gave an interview that would forever change the perception of the case. Notable is the opinion of Alan Radner, another journalist responsible for the 1982 interview that obtained an admission from alleged focus Janet Hodgson that she had played tricks on 2 occasions. This partial confession was used by skeptics as evidence that the entire case had been an elaborate fraud. But the reality of this confession is much more nuanced than has been reported. Janet didn't admit that everything was false, but rather acknowledged having played tricks on specific occasions. According to her testimony, these tricks represented less than 2% of all events documented during the 18 months of activity. Why would a girl who had been the center of one of the most documented paranormal cases in history partially admit to fraud? The answer reveals the incredible psychological pressure that Janet had experienced during years of intense public scrutiny. Janet explained that sometimes, when investigators were present and nothing paranormal occurred, she felt pressure to produce something, anything, to maintain her credibility. In those moments, she admitted to moving small objects or making minor noises to satisfy expectations. This partial confession was deliberately misinterpreted by some media that reported as if Janet had admitted everything was false. But a careful reading of the complete interview reveals something completely different. A teenager trying to explain the complexity of having lived at the center of a phenomenon she herself didn't fully understand. The investigators who knew Janet personally weren't surprised by this admission. They had documented thousands of events and knew that a few cases of inconsistent behavior didn't invalidate all the evidence they had collected. Despite all the controversies and partial confessions, the Enfield case produced some of the most convincing physical evidence in the history of paranormal investigation. Maurice Grosse and Lyon Playfair meticulously documented each event, creating a file of evidence that continues to be studied by investigators worldwide. The photographs from the case are particularly striking. A series of images captured by photographer Maurice show Janet apparently being thrown from her bed by an invisible force. The photographs were analyzed by photography experts who confirmed they had not been manipulated, and that the angle and speed of Janet's movement were consistent with having been thrown by an external force. The audio recordings are equally disturbing. Thousands of hours of tapes document not only the voices that emerged from Janet, but also inexplicable noises, intelligent knocks, and what appear to be conversations between multiple invisible entities. Professional voice analyses confirmed that the recorded voices were significantly different from Janet's natural voice, both in tone and speech patterns. But perhaps the most convincing evidence was the testimonies of independent witnesses. More than 30 people, including police officers, social workers, journalists, and neighbors, witnessed paranormal events in the Green Street house. These witnesses had no motivation to lie, and many of them had initially arrived as skeptics. One particularly well-documented incident occurred when a BBC cameraman was filming in the house. During filming, a chair lifted off the floor and moved several feet without anyone touching it, all captured on video. The cameraman, a professional with years of experience, confirmed there were no ropes, cables, or any kind of visible trick. The investigators also documented drastic and inexplicable temperature changes, anomalous electromagnetic fields, and other measurable physical phenomena that correlated with the reported paranormal events. To truly understand what might have occurred in Enfield, we need to examine what modern science tells us about poltergeist phenomena. Researchers have identified consistent patterns in poltergeist cases worldwide that shed light on the nature of these events. Most poltergeist cases center on adolescents, particularly girls going through puberty. Researchers have theorized that hormonal changes and emotional stress associated with this stage of development could somehow catalyze psychokinetic phenomena, the ability of the mind to influence physical matter. In the Enfield case, Janet was 11 years old when the events began, exactly the age where these phenomena tend to manifest. Her parents had recently divorced, creating an environment of emotional stress that could have contributed to the activity. But the psychokinetic theory doesn't explain all aspects of the Enfield case. Investigators documented phenomena that seemed to demonstrate independent knowledge, like the voices that provided verifiable historical information that Janet couldn't have known. Some scientists have proposed more radical theories. Quantum physicist Dr. Amit Goswami has suggested that poltergeist phenomena might involve aspects of quantum mechanics that we don't yet fully understand, where human consciousness interacts with physical reality in ways that challenge our current understanding. Other researchers have explored the possibility that these events represent some type of magnetic or electrical field phenomenon generated by the human brain under specific conditions of stress or emotional alteration. What makes the Enfield case so significant is that it provided investigators with the opportunity to study these phenomena in real time, with scientific instruments and under controlled conditions. The data collected continues to be analyzed by researchers worldwide. After examining all the evidence, testimonies, confessions, and scientific theories, what can we really conclude about the Enfield poltergeist? The answer is more complex than any simple narrative could explain. The evidence suggests that something extraordinary occurred at 284 Green Street between 1977 and 1979. The testimonies of multiple independent witnesses, the documented physical evidence, and the consistency of phenomena over 18 months make it almost impossible to dismiss everything as fraud or imagination. At the same time, Janet's partial confession and evidence of some occasional tricks demonstrate that not all reported events were genuine. But this doesn't necessarily invalidate the entire case, but rather reveals the human complexity involved in phenomena of this nature. The marginalization of the Warrens from the real case reveals how Hollywood can distort historical events to create more commercially viable narratives. The true story of Enfield is much more nuanced than the cinematic version, with serious investigators facing both scientific and ethical challenges. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Enfield case is that some aspects of human experience remain mysterious. In an era where we tend to seek simple and absolute explanations, Enfield reminds us that reality can be much more complex than our current belief systems can accommodate. The investigators who silenced certain aspects of the case didn't do so out of deception, but out of respect for a family that had experienced something that challenged their understanding of the world. Some secrets are kept not to hide the truth, but to protect those who have lived truths that others aren't prepared to face. The Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most documented and controversial paranormal cases in modern history. Regardless of whether you believe in the paranormal or not, the story of the Hodgson family reminds us that there are aspects of human experience that go beyond our current understanding, and that sometimes the most important questions don't have easy answers. The truth about Enfield isn't whether it was completely real or completely false, but that it represents something much deeper about the nature of reality, human perception, and the mysteries that still await our discovery. And perhaps that's the most chilling truth of all.